A governor just went live on television and told citizens to create a database of federal law enforcement officers for future prosecution. Not a database of criminals, a database of ICE agents that are doing their jobs. That same governor called Trump's immigration enforcement an occupation of his state and demanded that President Trump end it. And here's the part that should terrify you. Walz is not crazy. He's not stupid. He knows exactly what he's doing. Tim Walz is testing a question that could actually destroy this country. The question is this: what happens when a state governor simply says no to federal law? Not "I disagree with this policy," not "I'll challenge this in court," but "we will not comply, film the feds, resist and obstruct." Because right now in Minnesota, federal agents are surrounded at federal buildings. ICE operations are being disrupted. And one woman who rammed her car into an agent, sending him to the hospital with internal bleeding, well, she's being turned into a Democrat progressive martyr. And the media, they're running interference for Walz. They're calling these protests peaceful. They're accusing Trump of authoritarianism, all while he's enforcing federal immigration law. Meanwhile, there's a 217-year-old law that's sitting on the books that was specifically designed for this exact situation. It's been used 17 times, and Trump hasn't touched it yet. So today we're going to talk about what the Insurrection Act is, what it actually allows, and why what's happening in Minnesota right now might force President Trump's hand. Here's what they don't want you to know. The Insurrection Act isn't some authoritarian power grab. It's been law since 1807. It was signed by Thomas Jefferson himself, that same Jefferson that liberals claim to love. The law is simple. It allows the president to deploy the U.S. military forces and federalize state National Guard units to suppress insurrections, enforce federal law when it's being obstructed, and restore order when states can't or won't do it themselves. And here's the kicker. It's been invoked 30 times in American history. 17 presidents have used it. Eisenhower used it to enforce school desegregation in Little Rock, Arkansas. Kennedy used it during the Civil Rights Movement. Bush considered using it during Hurricane Katrina. So this isn't new. This isn't radical. This is constitutional law. But the media won't tell you that part, because if they admit that this is legitimate presidential power with 200 years of precedent, then they can't run their Trump is a dictator narrative. So instead, you get hysterical op-eds about the end of democracy, while actual federal agents are getting assaulted in American streets. So let's talk about Minnesota, because what's happening there right now is exactly what the Insurrection Act was designed for. The Trump administration sends 2,000 to 3,000 ICE agents to Minneapolis to enforce immigration law, which, by the way, is a federal law that every president is required to enforce. Within days, a woman named Renee Good rams her vehicle into an ICE agent, causing the agent to have internal bleeding. The agent shoots back in self-defense. Protests erupt across the Twin Cities. Federal buildings are surrounded and ICE operations are disrupted. And what does Minnesota Governor Tim Walz do? Does he call for calm? Does he work with federal authorities? Does he remind Minnesotans that attacking federal officers is a felony? No. Walz goes on statewide television and tells citizens to film federal agents and build a database of atrocities for future prosecutions. He calls the federal immigration operation an occupation and demands that President Trump end it. Walz literally said, "We will reclaim our communities from Donald Trump." Reclaim them from the president who's enforcing federal law? I mean, Walz, what law school did you go to? And here's the scary part. Tim Walz isn't alone. governors in California, Illinois, and other blue states are doing exactly the same thing. They're actively obstructing federal immigration enforcement. Now, let me read you the actual law. Section 252 of the Insurrection Act, it says the president can deploy military forces when there is an insurrection in any state which renders impracticable the enforcement of the law. Read that again. Renders impracticable the enforcement of federal law. So when governors are telling citizens to obstruct federal agents, refusing to cooperate with ICE detainers, filing lawsuits to block federal operations, and encouraging resistance to federal law enforcement, that's not peaceful protests. That's obstruction of federal law. And when protests turn into surrounding federal buildings, disrupting operations, and creating an environment where federal agents can't safely do their jobs, well, that's exactly what Section 252 was written for. Donald Trump doesn't need Minnesota's permission. He doesn't need Tim Walz's approval. The Insurrection Act explicitly allows the president to act over a governor's objection. In fact, the last time a president federalized a state's National Guard without the governor's consent was Lyndon Johnson in 1965. This was to protect civil rights protesters in Selma, Alabama. But when Donald Trump talks about using the same power to protect federal law enforcement officers from being assaulted in American streets, well, suddenly it's tyranny. Give me a break. But won't this look like martial law? No, because it's not martial law. The Insurrection Act is specific and has limited power. It doesn't suspend constitutional rights. It doesn't close courts. It doesn't end elections. It simply allows federal military forces to enforce federal law when local authorities won't or can't. So can the court stop him? They can try, but here's the reality. The Insurrection Act gives the president massive discretion. The Supreme Court has historically been very deferential to presidential decisions about what constitutes an insurrection or an obstruction. Could there be lawsuits? Yeah, sure. Tim Walz could probably file one from his car on the way to the courthouse. But Donald Trump would likely win because the law is clear, the precedent is strong, and the federal immigration enforcement is explicitly a federal responsibility. Well, isn't this what dictators do? No. You know what dictators actually do? They ignore laws that they don't like. Donald Trump enforcing federal immigration law and using his constitutional presidential powers, that does not equal dictatorship. Tim Walz telling citizens to obstruct federal law enforcement, well, that equals actual lawlessness. You see the difference now? So here's why Donald Trump needs to invoke the Insurrection Act. 1. Federal agents are being assaulted. Renee Good wasn't an isolated incident. There have been multiple confrontations, pepper balls deployed, federal buildings surrounded. These agents are trying to deport violent criminals, and they're being treated like an occupying force. 2. Governors are actively obstructing federal law. This isn't about sanctuary cities anymore. This is about state executives openly calling for resistance to federal immigration operations. That's not a policy disagreement. That's a constitutional crisis. 3. The alternative is complete chaos. If blue state governors can simply refuse to cooperate with federal immigration enforcement and actively encourage their citizens to obstruct it, then federal law means nothing. We don't have a country if California, Minnesota, and Illinois can just opt out of the laws that they don't like. 4. This is exactly what this law was designed for. Look at Section 253. The president can act when there's any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination of or conspiracy which results in the deprivation of constitutionally secured rights. Federal law enforcement officers have a constitutional right to do their jobs without being attacked. American citizens have a right to have federal laws enforced. That's what we voted for. And when state governments are actively preventing both, well, that's exactly what Section 253 is for. Trump has the authority. He has the justification. And frankly, he has the obligation to do it. If he lets Tim Walz and Gavin Newsom get away with this, he's sending a message to every blue state governor. And that message is, federal law is optional if you disagree with it. And that's not a precedent that any American should want. So to Tim Walz, who's on TV demanding, end this occupation. The only occupation happening right now is your occupation of the governor's mansion, where you're supposed to be governing, not organizing resistance movements. To the protesters that are surrounding federal buildings, you have every right to peacefully protest. But the second you start obstructing federal operations, well, you've crossed a line. And to President Trump, you've been hesitant to invoke the Insurrection Act. I get it. It's a huge step. But at what point does hesitation become negligence? Your ICE agents are getting attacked. Your federal operations are being sabotaged. And state governors are openly defying federal law on national television. The Insurrection Act exists for exactly this moment. Donald Trump, use it. Look, I know this makes people uncomfortable. Nobody wants to see federal troops deployed in American cities. But we also can't have a country where governors can simply nullify federal law that they just don't like. We can't have federal agents being assaulted while doing their jobs, and we can't have this double standard where the Insurrection Act is heroic when used for causes that the liberals support, but fascist when used to enforce immigration law. Insurrection Act is constitutional. It's precedented, and in Minnesota right now, it is necessary. Donald Trump has the legal authority. He has the justification. The question is, does Donald Trump have the will? So drop a comment. Should Donald Trump invoke the Insurrection Act in Minnesota? And which other cities need federal intervention as well? And hit subscribe, because this story is just getting started.
We won!
Okay, let's go.
We won!